In August of 1590, an English ship arrived off the coast of what is now North Carolina. On that ship was a man named John White. He wasn't just coming back as a governor, he was coming back as a father, a grandfather, and a man who had spent 3 years wondering if the people he loved were still alive. 3 years earlier, White had left more than 100 English settlers on Roanoke Island. His daughter was there, his son-in-law was there, and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was there too. She was the first English child known to be born in the Americas. So when White finally returned, he was probably expecting a difficult reunion. Maybe the colony would be hungry. Maybe the buildings would be damaged. Maybe the settlers would be angry that help had taken so long. But at least he expected someone to be there. Instead, when the search party reached the settlement, they found almost nothing. No people, no voices, no families waiting at the shore. The houses had been taken apart. The settlement was empty, and there were no bodies. There was no clear sign of a battle, no message explaining what had happened, no one left behind to tell the story. There was only one word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. More than 400 years later, that single word is still one of the most famous clues in American history. This is the story of the Lost Colony of Roanoke. To understand how more than 100 people ended up on this isolated island, we have to go back to the beginning. In the late 1500s, England was looking across the Atlantic with a mix of ambition and anxiety. Spain had become enormously wealthy from its colonies, and England wanted a foothold of its own. Sir Walter Raleigh received permission from Queen Elizabeth I to explore and settle lands in North America that were not already controlled by another Christian ruler. The plan was about more than planting a flag. A permanent English settlement could claim territory, open new trade routes, and provide a base for English privateers operating against Spanish ships. In 1584, Raleigh sent Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow across the Atlantic to scout the coast. They returned with glowing descriptions of fertile land, abundant resources, and friendly encounters. On paper, Roanoke sounded almost perfect, but the reports made the place seem easier and safer than it really was. That glowing report was tested almost immediately. In 1585, Raleigh sent 7 ships carrying around 600 soldiers and sailors toward Roanoke. This was not a family colony. It was a military expedition, led on the island by Governor Ralph Lane. The voyage was already troubled. The flagship Tiger was badly damaged, and much of the expedition's food supply was lost. A little more than 100 men remained on Roanoke to construct a fort and explore the surrounding region. They quickly learned that the island could not support them as easily as the reports had promised. The English became increasingly dependent on nearby Algonquian communities for food and local knowledge. As supplies disappeared, fear and suspicion began replacing cooperation. Lane became convinced that Wingina, also known as Pemasapan, was preparing an attack. In June of 1586, Lane's men struck first and killed him. A few days later, Sir Francis Drake's fleet appeared offshore. A powerful hurricane disrupted plans to resupply the colony, and the exhausted colonists accepted passage back to England. The first Roanoke colony had lasted less than a year. It had failed, but Raleigh was already preparing to try again. Raleigh's next attempt looked very different. In April of 1587, 117 men, women, and children left England under Governor John White. This time, the goal was not a military outpost. It was a permanent community called the City of Raleigh. Families brought tools, seeds, household supplies, and the expectation that they were starting new lives. Their intended destination was the Chesapeake Bay, roughly 90 miles north of Roanoke, where they hoped to find better land and safer conditions. Roanoke was only supposed to be a brief stop. White wanted to check on 15 men who had been left behind after Lane's colony departed. But when the colonists arrived on July 22nd, The men were gone. The only trace was one sun-bleached skeleton. Then, pilot Simon Fernandez refused to carry the settlers any farther north. Whatever his reasons, that decision left 117 people stranded at the site of an earlier failure. With nowhere else to go, they repaired the old fort and rebuilt the abandoned houses. This was no longer an experiment run by soldiers. There were husbands, wives, and children. And among them was White's pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare.
Roanoke did give the settlers one moment of real hope. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. She and her husband, Ananias, named the child Virginia. Virginia Dare became the first English child known to have been born in North America. For John White, she was more than a symbol of the colony's future. She was his granddaughter. But Virginia had been born into a settlement that was already in trouble. Shortly after the colonists arrived, George Howe was killed while gathering crabs alone near the water. The English retaliated against a village they believed was responsible, but they attacked members of the Croatoan community, people who had previously been friendly toward them. The mistake damaged one of the few relationships the colony could still depend on. Food remained uncertain, winter was approaching, and there was no reliable supply ship on the way. The colonists decided that someone had to return to England and ask for help. They chose John White. White resisted the idea. Leaving meant sailing away from his daughter, his son-in-law, and his newborn granddaughter. But without additional supplies, remaining on the island could place everyone in even greater danger. 9 days after Virginia's birth, John White agreed to leave Roanoke.
On August 27, 1587, John White left Roanoke. He sailed away only 9 days after the birth of Virginia Dare, leaving his daughter, son-in-law, and newborn granddaughter behind. Before White departed, he and the colonists agreed on a simple system. If they moved somewhere else before he returned, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or wooden post. If they had been forced to leave because of danger, they would add a cross beside the message. That small detail would become extremely important 3 years later. The colonists were also considering dividing into groups. Some would remain near Roanoke, while others could travel inland in search of safer ground and more reliable food. White expected his absence to be brief. He planned to return with food, tools, additional settlers, and enough supplies to carry the colony through winter. But the journey back across the Atlantic was miserable. Storms battered the ship, illness spread among the crew, and their remaining supplies became dangerously low. On October 16th, the damaged vessel finally reached Ireland. By November 8th, White had reached England and reported the colony's condition to Sir Walter Raleigh. He immediately began preparing to sail back. His family was waiting across the Atlantic, and every additional week mattered. But Europe had other plans.
John White expected to return to Roanoke by the spring of 1588. Instead, England began preparing for invasion. King Philip II of Spain had assembled an enormous fleet, the Spanish Armada, to attack England directly. Queen Elizabeth ordered English vessels to remain near home and help defend the country. Roanoke's supply mission was no longer a priority. For White, the reason may have made sense, but it did not make the waiting any easier. Every month that passed meant less food for the colony, another winter approaching, and more time without knowing whether his family was still alive. England defeated the Armada during the summer of 1588, but victory did not immediately give White a ship. Vessels were damaged or still needed for war, money was becoming harder to find, and Raleigh's attention was beginning to move elsewhere. White had no fleet of his own and no authority to order anyone across the Atlantic. He could only keep asking. Months became years. Across the ocean, there were no letters from Roanoke. No ships arrived with news. The silence was complete. Finally, in early 1590, White convinced a group of privateers traveling toward the West Indies to take him along. It was not a rescue mission. Roanoke would only be a stop,
and the privateers' own plans came first. They sailed from England on March 20th. By the time White finally approached the Outer Banks in August, almost 3 years had passed. Virginia Dare would have been 3 years old. White still did not know whether his family was waiting at Roanoke, living somewhere inland, or already gone.
On August 18th, 1590, John White finally stepped ashore on Roanoke Island. It was Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. But instead of finding his granddaughter, his daughter, or any of the settlers, White found an abandoned settlement surrounded by a newly built wooden palisade. The houses had not simply collapsed. They appeared to have been carefully taken apart, suggesting that the colonists had left deliberately and carried useful materials with them. Then the search party noticed letters carved into a tree. C-R-O. Farther inside the settlement, they found a complete word carved into one of the palisade posts. Croatoan. Before leaving 3 years earlier, White had told the colonists to carve the name of their destination if they moved. If they were forced to leave because of danger, they were supposed to add a cross. There was no cross. To White, the message did not look like a warning. It looked like an address. Croatoan was the name of both a nearby island, now known as Hatteras Island, and the indigenous community that lived there. Manteo, one of the colony's closest allies, was Croatoan. White believed his family and the other settlers had moved there. For the first time in 3 years, he had a real direction to follow. But before the ship could reach Croatoan, dangerous weather forced it away from the coast. White begged to continue the search, but the privateers would not risk their ship. He was carried back across the Atlantic without reaching the place named in the message. Since then, other explanations have been suggested. Some colonists may have moved inland. Some may have joined Croatoan communities. Famine, disease, conflict, or hurricane may also have played a part. But none of those explanations has been proven. The colonists left a destination behind. John White simply never got the chance to see what was waiting there.
When John White returned to England, he carried no final answer with him. He never saw his daughter Eleanor, his son-in-law Ananias, or his granddaughter Virginia again. White eventually settled in Ireland and slowly disappeared from the historical record. And maybe that is why Roanoke is so easy to treat like a puzzle. A missing colony, a carved word, more than 100 people who seem to disappear. But the settlers were not pieces in a mystery. They were families, laborers, craftsmen, and children trying to build permanent homes in a place they barely understood. The evidence suggests that they did not simply vanish in a single moment. The houses were dismantled, there was no clear sign of a battle, and the word Croatoan was left without the cross that was supposed to signal danger. The colonists probably moved away from Roanoke. What happened after that is where the evidence ends. Archaeologists have searched the region for more than a century. English objects have been found on Hatteras Island and at locations farther inland. But an object does not always tell us who carried it there. It could have belonged to a colonist, or it could have been traded from one community to another. Even the exact location of the 1587 settlement remains uncertain. Centuries of erosion and rising water may have carried part of the site away. So perhaps the mystery survives not because there are no clues, but because every clue stops just before the answer. We do not know where Eleanor Dare spent her final years. We do not know whether Virginia Dare grew up. And we do not know whether some of the colonists survived by becoming part of another community. What we do know is that they were here. They crossed an ocean, built homes, started families, and tried to survive. Roanoke was not simply a colony that disappeared. It was a community whose final chapter was never recorded.